Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this last research exchange talk of the fall semester. I'm Camille Crittenden. I direct the Data and Democracy Initiative here at CITRIS and also serve as Deputy Director. So we're really pleased to welcome you to the presentation here in Sutarjadai Hall this afternoon. We're also pleased to recognize our viewers who might be watching from other campuses. CITRIS is a consortium of campuses including Davis and Merced and Santa Cruz, as well as Berkeley. And so the program is being live webcast there, as well as into people's living rooms or studies or wherever they have a web browser. So we're really pleased to have you all watching either in person or online. The Research Exchange series will begin again in the spring semester starting on January 22nd, so mark your calendars for that. I'm sure you'll be getting announcements, and please register so that you will have a lunch waiting for you on that occasion as well. Just a quick reminder that everything in the lunch is recyclable except the tin foil, so if you could help us by throwing the foil in the garbage and not in the recycling, that would be great. We're really so pleased to have Marina Gorbis as our speaker this afternoon. She's a futurist and social scientist who serves as executive director at the Institute for the Future. It's a Silicon Valley nonprofit research and consulting organization based in Palo Alto. In her 14 years with IFTF, Marina has brought a futures perspective to hundreds of organizations in business, education, government, and philanthropy to improve innovation capacity, develop strategies, and design new products and services. It's been a great pleasure to work with Marina and a number of her staff on various projects here at CITRIS over the past year and a half or more, and a number of the CITRIS areas as well. So healthcare, energy, the environment, all of those areas. The Institute for the Future also has experts and people who are actively researching and thinking about the future in those areas. Marina's current research focuses on how social production is changing the face of major industries, a topic explored in detail in her book, The Nature of the Future, Dispatches from the Social-Structured World. So I highly recommend her book to you as well, and she'll be giving you a few highlights from that today. Marina holds a BA in psychology and a master's of public policy from UC Berkeley, so we're happy to have her back on campus. And also just want to mention that we're honored to have her serve on the advisory board of the Data and Democracy Initiative. So it's my special pleasure to welcome Marina Gorbis.
Thank you. Thanks, Camille. It's always so great to be back in Berkeley. It's amazing to me that after almost 20 years of living on the peninsula, this still feels like home. And when I come here, it feels like these are my people. So it's great to be here. And one thing that I carry with you forever is I'm always 10 minutes late to every meeting, which annoys a lot of people. But it's part of my Berkeley DNA. Very happy to share some of the ideas from my book. And you can see the title is Dispatches from the Socialstructed World. And I have to tell you that when I was writing the book, and at the end, as you select the title, my editor forbade me from using that word anywhere in the title because it was too complex, too complicated. So fortunately or unfortunately, my editor was laid off about 2 months before the publication of the book, and the new editor came in and I snuck it in. But the reason I got sort of attached to that word is because I wanted to communicate two ideas. We're structuring something new. We're learning how to create value in new ways, and at the kind of core of how we're doing is social technologies and social ties. So it's a very social experience, this new way that we're creating value. One thing I want to say in general about the Institute, how many of you are familiar with the Institute and what we do? Quite a few people. I always like to tell people that we don't predict the future. That's not what the purpose of the Institute is. And I firmly believe that nobody can predict the future, although we're developing a lot of interesting techniques and technology. Thank you. And if anybody's working on ways to predict the future, I would love to hear what you're working on. I'm always open. And there are certain things. There's prediction markets. There are certain tools that we're developing that you can predict certain things and events, kind of point events. But really what the purpose of the Institute is to systematically think about the future, borrowing, stealing from academia, using a variety of different techniques. We've been around for 45 years. So over the years, we've used many different techniques for thinking systematically about the future. Quantitative surveys, Delphi techniques, scenarios, and other kinds of things. But ultimately, to me, the purpose of thinking about the future is not to predict the future, but to help people make better decisions. One of the things I like to say is the future kind of doesn't have a voice. We're not actually very good at thinking about the future and taking future considerations into account. The future generations are not of the future, and ultimately we use a process called foresight to insight to action. We define foresight as developing plausible, internally consistent visions of the future. I sometimes think of them as thinking about what are the core defining stories or transformations that will be shaping us in 10, 15 years and more. What are we going to be concerned about? What are we going to be thinking about? So identifying that and then working with different organizations and communities to think about, so given that, what are some of the insights? Why is this important to us? Why do we care about it? What should we be worrying about? And ultimately, helping them make better decisions. So the foresight and the vision may be 10, 15 and more years out, but decisions may be something that you can take tomorrow or the day after or in the next year and beyond. So a lot of our work really looks at technologies because technology is a transformational force. However, what we're interested in, most of the people at the Institute today are social scientists. So we're really interested in the interaction of technologies and social organizations. In some ways, technologies are easier to forecast. You kind of see what's being developed in the lab. You see what startups are being formed. You can see where the money is going. So you kind of can roadmap some of the technologies. The problem is that once these technologies get out of the lab into the wild, into our social life, it's much harder to forecast what are we going to be doing with these technologies? How are we going to be using it? How is it going to reshape our life, our daily life, our work, and other things? So a lot of our work is looking at fundamental technologies, but ultimately asking questions, what does it mean for us as a society, as organizations, as people, as families, as communities, and so on. So in writing the book, I went back to this somewhat famous diagram from Paul Baran. How many people are familiar with who Paul Baran is? Great. Paul was one of the key developers of packet switching technology, which is a foundational technology for the internet. And in this paper in 1964, he was at the time working at RAND Corporation, a large research think tank. And this was the 60s, so guess what he was working on? They were worried about what's going to happen. This was a time of the Cold War. What's going to happen in case of nuclear attack? How do we preserve our foundational telecommunications infrastructure so we can coordinate post-attack activities, so we can basically rebuild and coordinate all of this work? And the infrastructure very much looked like this. It was highly centralized, large data flowing through centralized nodes. So Paul and others suggested moving to a very different kind of infrastructure that's much more resilient, where basically large bits of data are broken down into smaller bits, and they travel down various paths. So you can take out one little node, and information can still flow through other nodes. So it's sort of self-healing. It's emergent. It's less predictable. But it's harder to take down. Ultimately, it's much more resilient. And as you can see, there's sort of no center to it. So that's Paul's idea. And by the way, when he presented this whole idea on how people will be using it, he presented it to AT&T, and they laughed him out of their offices. He passed away last year. We found a lot of his papers and were reading and were just blown away with what he foresaw in the 1960s. So our technology infrastructure, basically this is the internet. This is something we've been building for the last 40 years. This is the foundation. It's tightly woven into every aspect of our lives. But the interesting thing, as many social scientists and others have pointed out, is that when we change our foundational technology infrastructure, when we change our communications infrastructure, we don't just change our technologies, we change our society. Marshall McLuhan has another quote that says, we invent our technologies and our technologies reinvent us. So we're in this constant co-evolution. And so what I see and what I talk about and write about in the book is that basically our social and economic life is beginning to resemble that foundational infrastructure, that we're increasingly moving from a system in which most value and most resources and most knowledge was flowing through large, pretty hierarchical institutions to being created in this new, much more emergent, much more resilient, much more decentralized, distributed way. And there's kind of a economic foundation for it. Any economists in the room? Ron Coase, okay. So Ron Coase is another person who passed away last year at the ripe age, I believe, of 105 or something, so he must have been doing something right. But in 1937, he wrote this paper posing a question, why do we need a firm? Why do we need a corporation? Why do we need any kind of institution? And the answer is that it's because transaction costs. So why don't we just, the reason we don't just individually produce and trade with each other is because it's possible to do on a small scale. But when you basically scale up production, when you have to manage more resources, when you have to manage more people, when you have to produce more, you create these layers of basically coordination mechanisms, which you can think of as management layers and other kinds of things. So basically, the reason we have these organizations are to manage transaction costs. In some ways, you can think about institutions as a kind of technology that basically allows us to scale up production, to increase the level of what we are creating while minimizing costs. And that's exactly what is being disrupted by this new kind of infrastructure. It's changing our cost structure. All of a sudden, you don't need layers. You don't need large organizations. You can obtain a lot of resources. Not everything and not in every domain, but you can do a lot of this coordination and management and getting access to things without large organizations. So at the Institute, and that's really the nature of what I call social structuring. And at the Institute, we use a framework that we call the two-curve framework. So, which basically says that in any period of large transformation, and I believe we're in such period now, we're sort of, as a society, operating along two curves. One curve is what we call the incumbent curve. So this is the way things have always been done. We have regulations, we have institutions, we have norms that we created along that path, but ultimately it's sort of this way of doing things is somewhat on the decline. And at the same time, you have this nascent new way of doing things that's emerging. And we don't know exactly what shape it's going to take or how it will evolve, but we're just beginning to see signals of new ways of doing things. So when I think about these two curves, what I think about, to me, is the incumbent curve. It's a curve of institutional production where, as I said, all the value, all the resources, everything was done through large institutions. And the new curve is what I call the curve of social structured creation. And my definition of social structuring, it's about creating value by aggregating micro-contributions from large networks using social tools and technologies. So that's at the core of social structuring. And one of the things I want to say, though, is that it doesn't mean that all the large organizations are going to go away, and there's probably going to be new kinds of institutions that are being created. But we're right at the point where we're seeing emergence of new forms of value creation. We don't have the regulatory infrastructure to think about that yet. We don't have all the norms and tools and processes. We're sort of innovating. So a lot of our work at the Institute is looking at those signals. But it's, as I see it, it's really affecting almost every industry, every organization, every aspect of what we're doing. So I'm going to give you just a few examples from different domains. Some of them might be close to you. And these domains are around work, educational learning, and governance. So social structured work, to me, one thing to think about, when you think about the future, you almost have to think many, sometimes centuries back. Because a lot of times we're so wedded to what we know in our lifetime in the last 100 years that seems to be the norm. But when you think about it, we didn't always live through large organizations. We didn't always organize. We didn't always have scientific management. And it doesn't mean that we didn't create value. It doesn't mean that we were sitting around doing nothing. I mean, if you look at the whole human experience of humanity, it's only the last probably 200 years that we've developed the main concepts that's been driving a lot of how we think about value creation and organization. And as I said, we're now seeing signals of new ways of doing work. And some of these signals probably familiar. How many people are familiar with Odesk? How many people participate in Odesk and contribute? But Odesk is a platform that is, to me, one of those signals. It's basically a platform on which anybody can post a task to perform. The task could be coding, it could be editing, it could be marketing, it could be all kinds of other things. It could be translation, learning, other kinds of things. And anybody from around the world can basically fulfill the task. I found out that several people at the Institute actually use this platform and are doing some of the research and amplifying their work with people who are working in Odesk, which creates interesting kind of issues about ownership, intellectual property, all kinds of things. You know, are they your employees? Are they? What do you do with these people? But this platform has been growing tremendously. I think it now has 4 million people participating and contributing to Odesk, and billions of dollars of values that's being generated. And there are several platforms like that we see emerging. This is another platform that's probably more familiar, TaskRabbit, kind of the same thing, but it's using physical things. So anybody is available to do a courier job or to deliver things or to fix things. The highest demanded job on TaskRabbit is assembling IKEA furniture. So if you're good at that, you might be able to supplement. And this is another, in manufacturing, we're seeing this also new ways of creating things. So combination of tech shop. People are familiar with tech shop. It's basically a place, space where it's a membership, and anybody who's interested in creating things and making things can come to tech shop and be a member. You can prototype. This is David Lang, and this is one of his products, which is an underwater kind of sensing robotics device that he prototyped at tech shop with the help of other people around him. He created a prototype. He went to Kickstarter. He got funding to actually develop this product and to manufacture it. He engaged the whole flexible manufacturing network in China and in other places, and now he's producing this without really having a company. And so when you talk to David, and you say, well, are you going to grow? Are you going to have hundreds of people? And he says, no, I'm really happy. I just want 5 people. I'm working with 5 people, and that's good. You know, I'm going to move and produce something else. And when we talk about sort of return of manufacturing, I think about that yes, manufacturing, I think, is going to be vibrant, is going to come back, but it's going to look very, very different. A colleague of mine doing this research on what you call social manufacturing, and that's the place. It's about creating prototypes, being part of a manufacturers and makers community. It's using resources like Odesk and others, and basically creating things and creating value in new ways. So learning is probably something really familiar to you all, being here at Berkeley, and there have been a lot of conversations about the future of higher ed. We've been involved at the Institute in a lot of these discussions about learning and what's going to happen. And unfortunately, most of the discussions people have been fixated about MOOCs, right, massively open online courses. And now there's a whole sort of there's a lot of negative stuff coming out about MOOCs, and I always thought it's kind of a misplaced conversation that we're focusing so much on MOOCs. I think that with these technologies, we actually need to rethink what learning is and pedagogy in a very dramatic way. And it's not because of MOOCs. So this is probably a familiar moment, right? You're with somebody, you're with a group of your friends somewhere out there in the world. Somebody has a question. Nobody has an answer. You pop out your devices or whatever devices you have, and everybody's looking, and you find your answer. And it's not a trivial moment, right? Because to me, it's what I call a micro-learning moment. So basically, you're in a context, you're in a social setting where everybody is motivated to find something out, to learn together. And that information is available right there. So it's highly contextually rich. It's when you need it. You've got a social environment, social setting that drives you to want to acquire that information. And that information becomes a social object. And there's been many studies that showed actually that kind of information, people retain that information more than in other modes. So now we have these moments that potentially every moment of our life can be this micro-learning moment. This is a project, it's a joint project, USC and UCLA, called Hypercities, where basically you can walk around the city with your device pointed to a building, and it will give you all kinds of very rich information about the building, who lived there, maybe some videos, maybe some stories, what's the demographic environment in that area. So think about the difference between sitting in a classroom and learning about anything and having this kind of experience where you're in context, you're walking around, you want to, and information is right there. It's much more sensory rich information. And if you're not interested in architecture, there's apps like this called Snapleaf, where you can walk around with your mobile device and you can take a picture of a leaf, and it will give you information of what the genus of the tree it came from, where it grows, the history of it, and all kinds of basically biology information. So if you think about it, in many ways, the classroom experience is a sensory poor experience. And now we have a possibility of really literally taking learning into the real world in a very highly contextual way with these new tools, in a highly rich sensory way. So I think the conversation about MOOCs is kind of misplaced. It's not about MOOCs. It's about rethinking what learning is and how people learn and what are the best places. And what works for biology may not work for physics, and what works for geography may not work for math. But there's an opportunity to rethink the whole pedagogy and the learning process. And now this rich, besides MOOCs, there's so much real knowledge and information that's out there in the world, and it's everything from Coursera to Wikipedia to hundreds of other sites where these resources reside. So MOOCs is just one small part of it. So to me, social structured learning, in many ways, it's about aggregation of these micro-learning experiences that are based in this rich ecology, drawing on this rich ecology of content and driven by social and intrinsic rewards in many ways. And there is a group of people we've been doing, this is a map that we did on the future of learning, and the title of the map, we call it From Educational Institutions to Learning Flows. So this is an environment in which increasingly we're going to be living, where that information, wherever it resides, is out there. Think of it as a river of information and resources that anybody can tap into and come in and out of at any time. And the challenge becomes very, very different in that kind of environment. The challenge becomes what motivates people to dip into that rich ecology of learning. One of the workshops we just did at the Institute, we call it extreme learners. So already we're seeing populations of kids and adults and other people that we call extreme learners. People who are taking 20 Coursera classes on their own, people who are directed to learn on their own, and those are the people who are taking advantage of this kind of resource. So the question to me becomes, what is it that drives people? A lot of it is social. How do you create social conditions for people to want to dip into that incredible flow of knowledge? How do we organize learning to take advantage of that? And I think that conversation is much different than the conversation about MOOCs. I like using this analogy. Are there students here in the room? Some? Sort of students. Okay, well, you don't have this dilemma anymore, but I have a son who faces this dilemma. And basically the dilemma is this. It's that two-curve dilemma. You know, do you choose to pursue learning through educational institutions, or do you go into this learning flow and self-direct and use the resources and organize differently? And some of the new examples of that people are doing, whether you like them or not, I think there's a lot of experimentation in this domain. I don't think anybody got it right. But I think we need to kind of redirect the conversation from what's going to happen to this institution or what are MOOCs about, to really thinking about what is the pedagogy? How do we structure learning? What are the resources we need to have to really take advantage of these learning flows? Very different conversation. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about governance because of where we are and the center. We actually had a conference on created a governance futures labs, because as you know, our governance system hasn't changed in 200 years, and it's stressed, I would say, to put it mildly. It doesn't really work particularly well on multiple counts, and we've moved as far from this sort of Greek notion of democracy, open democracy, although that wasn't a perfect democracy either, but we've moved as far as away from it as I can think of. And I think there are signals that that's one of those areas where a lot of interesting things and innovations are possible. And the reason I believe that, and most of that experimentation is probably happening at the local level, at the city level, at the town's level, in other kinds of domains. But 4 reasons why I think that this is a ripe area for experimentation of some of the innovation is that, first of all, the abundance of data. Basically, we're all carrying and creating our own data. The devices that we're carrying, from phone to sensors to other things, allows us to collect on our own tremendous amounts of data. So some of this data, this project, City Pulse in Paris, it's a watch-like device. It basically monitors in levels of pollutants in the environment. It turns out that aggregated 1,000 people in Paris carried this particular device, and the data was much better than the data was that government officials were able to create in any other way. So we are collecting this data, and I see the data increasingly moving out of sort of institutions, census bureaus, and other sort of centralized organizations into people's hands. Sometimes this data is very rich data. It's video. This is from one of our fellows, Sam Gregory, who I think spoke here, where they're documenting human rights abuses with cameras from all around the world and aggregating that data. So the important thing is that people are increasingly collecting their own data. They're aggregating. We have this whole quantified self movement where people are sharing their health information, but many, many other things. So to me, data is it's not the critical, but it's piece of this new ecology. We're creating much more sophisticated decision support tools for policy, for governance, for understanding all kinds of things, from very silly things, but it still is a great learning tool. The Budget Hero, where it was a game produced by PBS, where you can basically plug in and play with the federal budget and see what the impacts would be. That's on a kind of game-like level, to pretty sophisticated models that people can create for themselves, like this one, where you can basically look at where you live and what's the best energy source for you would be in your particular area. So you can create your own sort of management system. We have all kinds of engagement platforms. Ken Goldberg has Opinion Space. The Institute uses a different kind of platform where people can participate. We can't all come on a hill somewhere in Athens, but we can all come together on some digital hill and can actually have pretty good conversations about what may work, what may not work. This is a platform that the Institute has called the Foresight engine. We've been using it for many different things and are quite excited about it, including for organizational visioning. But this one was actually used for the city of Christchurch in New Zealand after the earthquake, where it was used to solicit ideas from people. What should they do after the earthquake? What are some of the ideas for reconstruction? What they should be rebuilding? And this particular platform is not sufficient to accomplish the whole process, but it's a piece of it that people, you can take a pulse of what people are thinking. You can moderate conversations. You can really understand where the hot zones are for conversations and what some of the new ideas might be. And again, there are new ways in which people are engaging and participating in provision of some of the basic services at the city level and in their communities. I like this particular example. This was, how many people are familiar with this? This is basically a platform built by the fire department in San Ramon. It was built by a summer intern. And what it does is it's a CPR app, and it identifies if you have CPR training, you can download this app. And what it allows you to do is that anytime somebody has a heart attack, it identifies who's the closest to that person, literally within a few feet, and provide help, be a good Samaritan. And actually, their rate of survival from heart attacks has increased tremendously. The other thing that happened once they unveiled this app, they got oversubscribed in terms of CPR classes. They didn't have enough CPR classes. So it just tells you there's this untapped capacity for people to do great things in their community. And if you can tap into that, there are all kinds of amazing things that are possible. And that's just one example of this micro-participation by communities in the work. And to me, the social-structured governance is really about being able to govern beyond government, being able to govern as a community in your own affairs. I know it's one of the hardest things for us to conceive of, and I think there are many experiments in this domain. I don't think we have sort of the next killer app in that, and it's about a lot of experimentation, and I think cities and local communities are probably the best places to do this kind of experimentation. One of the exercises we did in our Governance Futures Lab is we engaged people at the ground up sort of redesign of governance. And it started basically with a basic question. We used the future design process, and it started with the basic questions. What are your core values? And then you design, and then you go through the design exercise. But we haven't asked that. What are our core values as a society, as a community? And it's a really important conversation on which to build all these other domains. So what I wanted to leave you with is, this is just kind of a very high-level overview of what I see as some of the possibilities of this new social-structured way of value creation across many domains. There are similar things happening in research. There are similar things happening in health. They're encouraging, and there are a lot of things that we haven't worked out as part of it. So we're like in this process. We're right in between the two curves, trying to figure out how do we move from this to this? What do we need to move? What's the new infrastructure do we need to create for that second curve? We're not there yet. Frankly, I think it's probably 20, 30-year process, or maybe longer. But happy to take questions and ask you, what do you think? What are your experiences in this? What are some of the dark sides of it? I always love talking about the dark side. Yeah?
Well, I think we should thank Marina first. And for questions, use the mic, please. Where were you going here?
test. You put up there was a 105-year-old who published a paper in the early 60s. You put up 3 directed graphs, and you posed it as a solution to surviving a nuclear attack. And I think that it might have happened not through design but through turf wars. And in September 11th, we found that it was because of turf wars of all these government failures. You know, the 19 suicide terrorists were in sight of the headquarters of the NSA at one point. So compare that to a colleague of yours who might be more on the bleeding edge of futurist action, named WikiLeaks. Mm-hmm. And so like turf wars versus WikiLeaks.
And tell me more. What? And
I thought that was enough material to keep you busy for a long time. But
is it about turf? Yeah, turf.
Will there be more WikiLeaks? Will there be more September 11th because of turf wars?
Oh, I see.
You know, I mean, I see Obama is holding his cards. You know, he's shooting down all these whistleblowers. So he's re-centralizing the data. Mm-hmm. And you know,
yeah,
the imperialists.
I personally think that there will be a lot more WikiLeaks and there will be a lot more Snowdens, because you have too many people having access to information in one way or another, and it may be a tiny piece of information, but it's just windows. So possibilities of more people, even with that protected and guarded and everything else, it's like a cat and mouse game, right? So we've developed more encryption technologies, and the hackers develop better techniques for breaking. So it's a constant sort of cat and mouse game, but ultimately I see that information is becoming more distributed in multiple ways. First of all, we're collecting more information. There's just more to go around. And second, it's just that no matter what, there are more people having ability to enter that information stream.
Okay, so we collecting more data might be the NSA, but there's 4 million people that work for the NSA, so there's a lot of people able, if one had a heart and becomes an Edward Snowden.
It only takes one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. One of the quotes, I think, in the beginning was that we don't create technology, that technology creates us. And whenever I see a talk on technology, I usually miss, it doesn't usually include the negatives that come with it. Mm-hmm. You know, the people tend to spend most of their day around their computers, sitting on their desk. There is the radiation, all kinds of other things associated with technology. There were a couple of things that you said kind of struck me. One of them was when you were talking about Odesk, and that there's no legal framework in place that would regulate the relationship between me and my employee. And you said we don't know what to do with these people. And the other thing what you said was that with the course, with that free courseware website, we said that the students can learn anything by themselves. So
in social settings, not by themselves.
Okay, I think you said...
Big difference.
Okay, I heard by the sense, but my point is that we are losing relationships, like we are losing relationships to other real people through the like this mass almost like mass hysteria adoption of technologies without actually thinking about what it actually replaces. Mm-hmm. And I think for humans, relationships are the most important thing. And I think it's kind of obvious to anybody who thinks about it, the way we use the technology right now, that actually doesn't help. It kind of destroys these relationships. And the other thing is that we are actually imposing these kind of solutions, technology and solutions, on the rest of the world, where they have these strong social structures in place, and by imposing the technology, we actually destroy them. And anyway, so whenever we talk about technology, I would like to hear also about the dark side of it.
Right.
Thank you.
I can tell you 10 dark parts of this, and in the book I talk about some of the dark scenarios, but they may be different from the kind of dark scenarios. One thing I want to say is that, I forget who said that, it may be Aristotle, that no innovation enters our society without its evil. So you can say that about any technology. Every technology has something that's amazing. You think nuclear, it's about imaging, it's about all kinds of amazing things, and it also can use for war. I don't see this technology as any different. It creates its own set of dilemmas, its own set of issues, but they're different from other technologies. So that's one, just to me, that's fundamental sort of rule of technologies. There's no technology that you can say it's all for the benefit, and there is no technology you can say it's all about evil. We just have to understand what are these new dilemmas that we will need to manage and create and compensate for in other areas. To me, the dark side is not that, because ultimately I don't believe that technologies by themselves destroy social relationships. And, you know, Putnam wrote this famous book, Bowling Alone, about destroying bowling leagues and traditional communities. If you look at what's happening in this area, there are meetups, there are hackathons, there are co-housing, new kinds of ways that it's where people are creating and building those relationships that's different to me. You know, we can argue about that, but I don't see that. If I see the dark side of this, to me, the darkest side is that this sort of distributed infrastructure, which is so wonderful, is basically at the core of it, it's also creating monopolies and oligopolies. So you can think of Google and other Facebook. Now, they're probably easily displaced, but there is this network effects that basically bring a lot of wins to a few. And that's driving some of the income disparities that we're seeing now. So they're kind of like the new plumbing, the new foundation of this infrastructure, right? And we've learned to regulate that infrastructure. We have banking regulations. Well, we used to. Anyway, we had banking regulations. We had oil regulations. We have all kinds of regulatory systems that came into place as we were transitioning to one kind of infrastructure. We don't have that today. Whether we will go there, and I think one of the positive things about this whole debate about data and where data goes and collection of data is that maybe we're kind of inching our way to thinking about what's the regulatory framework? What do we need to do to protect against abuses? So to me, that's the fundamental sort of dark scenario. Is about what's called digital feudalism. So basically, we're all participating in the commons, we're all contributing, and there's these commons resources, but the commons are not free. They're not commons. They're private commons. There's a potential oligopolies and monopolies that are embedded in that. So I think we need to worry about that seriously.
Thanks, Marina. That was a great talk. So I have a question about democratic innovation. And about open government practices. You mentioned that in your talk. So, based on my experience about participatory practices in governance, it seems like the technology is there. Like, for instance, in getting people to get them involved in policy making online, we get people to participate. The crowd is smart. All that works out smoothly. But then the biggest challenge is actually change the culture. So it's not like a technological challenge, but it's rather like a cultural challenge. Yep. Because the incumbents, the establishment, they don't want to lose their power, and they see all these new methods and transparency in government as a challenge for them, obviously. Yep. So how do you see that change to happen? Like, how would that get started, and what is required for that cultural change?
I think that's a real tough one. That to me is that first curve, second curve, And if you look at like Clayton Christensen's The Innovators Dilemma, it's not the people on the first curve that move to the second curve because there are vested interests, there's legacy systems. It's really hard to move those people. What I see happening in many places, it's sort of innovation on the edges. So people start doing these things on their own, disregarding what the other side is doing. And hopefully, in some cases, they create this critical mass where they become the dominant sort of way of doing things. They become, in some ways, the dominant culture. The other one just becomes less prominent. It's very hard to do with established sort of. It's very hard to change established bureaucracies, established institutional. There are all kinds of incentives built in already that you're disturbing. It's like disturbing an ecosystem, right? And it sort of doesn't want to go there. But the other thing is, I do think that in this, having spent a lot of my time doing economic development work and being trained as sort of an economist, I've come to the conclusion that the problem with economics and that is that economists don't have a language to talk about culture. So in any kind of economic development project, we can easily talk about economic incentives. We can talk about infrastructure. We can talk about educational institutions. But we have no language to talk about culture. Like, what is that intrinsically motivate people to act differently, to behave differently? That's why some of the behavioral economics and other things that we're learning now, gives me some hope. But I think fundamentally, cultures are very difficult to change. And we haven't hacked that. If I had a hackathon, I would do it on culture hacking. Like, how do you hack cultures on a large scale?
Yes, hi. I'm interested in the idea of microlearning, and it's interesting. It's something we're all familiar with. We do it all the time, and it works great for simple questions, looking up facts. But for more complicated issues, maybe there's so many unreliable sources of information or false statements and opinion. And I guess my question is there any research about how people view information they find? Are people generally skeptical or critical about the things they read, or do people accept things? How does that work?
And one thing thanks for bringing that up. One thing I wanted to say is that microlearning doesn't mean that it's 5 minutes of your attention. It could be 5 hours, it could be 10 hours, it could be days, but it feels differently. It doesn't feel like it's work. It doesn't feel like it's imposed. It's self-driven, which is a very, very different experience. And it's amazing what people can do when they're intrinsically, there is no substitute for that. You can give grades, you can give rewards, you can give all kinds of things, but there's nothing like internal motivation to get something. And so, to me, in terms of what it means in terms of information, and I think people are becoming more sophisticated, and there have been a lot of studies about how people read information and what clues them to whether it's the right kind of information or not. I think, not everybody is sophisticated about it, but I think as more of it is out there, people are becoming more sophisticated. I do think that Howard Rheingold, he has this course called Peerology, and one of the things he talks about is media literacy. So teaching people about what to trust and verify and where and what are the trusted sources of information, I think is a critical element of learning today.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is, I wonder if you could say something a little bit more about your Foresight engine, sort of how it works and sort of just more detail about that. And the other is, you described or mentioned a number of similar kinds of platforms or apps or whatever that depend on an aggregation of micro-participants. And I wondered, what are the mechanisms of dissemination about just their presence? In other words, how do people find out about them? How do people get attracted to them, sign on to them, and so forth?
Yeah. So the first one about the Foresight engine is actually something that was developed by Jane McGonigal, who's another Berkeley grad, who's a game designer and game researcher, amazing person. And it uses some of the basic gaming techniques to encourage participation. But basically the way it works, it's a platform on which we post a provocative, enticing video about the future. And it could be future of the hospital, it could be future of governance, it could be future of Christ Church, and then invites people for small contributions to express their opinions, like, what do you think might happen? What's the best case scenario? What do you think? And it creates these threaded conversations. So, somebody may contribute, and there are points awarded for contributions, and there are more points awarded if you are building on somebody else's idea. So you get rewarded for contributing to a conversation rather than just throwing out ideas. It's highly facilitated. We have game guides that stay up. They last anywhere between 36 and 48 hours, and they are basically totally involved in facilitating the conversations and directing the conversation and pointing out the right ideas. And then what we do from that is you basically have incredible amount of almost like ethnographic material that you mine for what is the most used words, what is the most important conversation threads, where are the outliers, what are the threads that a lot of people built on. So you do all kinds of analysis on that to basically identify like core themes, like these are important conversations to pay attention to, and then that becomes basically a platform for people to take some actions. I'm describing it at a very high level, but if you go to IFTF site, we just ran a public Foresight engine for UCSF in San Francisco, envisioning the future of UCSF. And in addition to running the Foresight engine, they actually, to me, it just blew my mind because they engaged so many people. 10% of staff participated in the conversation about their future, including from the chancellor to the contracting office. People who usually don't participate in visioning sessions or strategy conversations. And so we're so incredibly grateful just for that. So you get this amazing level of engagement. So strategy is not something that just comes down from some up in the sky. It becomes an emergent process where a lot of people are participating and taking ownership, and that's just part of the process that they're using. They're also having workshops around it. They're engaging people across the organization. It's really exciting. What was the second question? Sorry. How do people find out? I am amazed that not more people know about this stuff. And, every time I talk to a lot of universities, and this is one of those things that their students should know about. And, to me, it just says that every organization needs to have a part of it that's looking at those innovations, looking at those new platforms, following them around, see what's happening and bringing it back. You can find it online, you can read about it, but it just hasn't reached that level of diffusion on its own. You find through, you Google it, but what do you Google? Yeah.
Do we have time for one more question?
Thanks for a really interesting talk. I think it was Ivan Illich, maybe you can hear at Berkeley, who said that every new technology, once it's adopted fully, involves an amputation of some human quality. And I wonder about those qualities that we don't even recognize that we have. The second curve that you're talking about is moving so fast that I wonder if there may be amputations that we don't even, of limbs that we don't even know we have, and how we try to track or predict or identify those. Yeah, I love that metaphor of amputation. It requires amputation, but the patient doesn't want to amputate. It's really hard. So amputation sort of happens by attrition in many ways, but so many resources are wasted in that capacity that is, and to me, it goes to the whole notion of how do you give people incentives to move to that? How do you make it exciting and not just threatening?
it's ultimately kind of a balance, right? And something we've gone through it in the publishing industry. Media industry probably was the first one to go through some substantial amputation, and still going through that. We're not done. And now it's like rolling across the landscape in many other places. I think that it's the problem with amputation is that the amputees don't have the incentive to go away or to change. And so there's something, if you can create incentives in the system for that to happen, but it's hard.
Thank you, Marina.
Thank you.